The moment the truck's rear door swung open and Diego Luna saw the police officer's face, he understood with perfect clarity that they'd been sold out before they'd even left Mexico. The officer's expression wasn't surprise or triumph. It was almost apologetic, like a man forced to play a role in someone else's tragedy. Behind him, 3 more officers stood with hands on their weapons, positioned perfectly to cut off any escape route. They'd been waiting, not searching, not investigating, waiting. But to understand how 3 men ended up trapped like animals in a grocery delivery truck, surrounded by boxes of produce and broken dreams, you need to go back 12 hours to a warehouse in Nuevo Laredo where desperation made even obvious traps look like opportunities. Diego had sworn he'd never try again after the first time. That disaster 2 years earlier. Hidden in a car trunk for 6 hours, nearly suffocating before Border Patrol dogs found them, had landed him in detention for 3 months and left it with a 10-year ban from entering the United States. But promises made in safety crumble when faced with necessity, and Diego's necessity had a name: Sophia. His daughter was 4 years old, living in Houston with his ex-wife who crossed legally years before their relationship imploded. The custody agreement was worthless across international borders. Video calls twice a week weren't enough. Watching another man slowly become daddy in his daughter's life while he remained a face on a screen, that was a special torture reserved for deported fathers. So when word spread through the construction site where he worked that El Güero had a foolproof new method, Diego listened despite himself. Not desert crossings or river swims or hidden compartments. This was elegant in its simplicity. Commercial delivery trucks that crossed daily, drivers who knew the inspection routines, and most importantly, a network of contacts on both sides who ensured safe passage. $8,000. That was the price for simplicity. Diego had $4,000 saved from 2 years of 16-hour days. He borrowed the rest from his brother, promising repayment within 6 months once he was working in Houston. His brother didn't argue. He'd seen Diego dying slowly in Nuevo Laredo, becoming a ghost of the man who used to make Sophia laugh. The meeting with El Güero happened in the back office of an auto parts store that fronted his real business. The smuggler was younger than Diego expected, maybe 30, with a confident air of someone who'd never been caught. His operation was professional, he explained, showing photos on his tablet of successful crossings, testimonials from satisfied clients, even a few selfies of people at their destination. The plan seemed solid. A legitimate produce company, Hernandez Brothers Distributors, ran daily deliveries from their Nuevo Laredo warehouse to grocery stores throughout South Texas. The drivers were all in on it. Each truck could carry 3 to 4 people hidden among the legitimate cargo. The key was timing and placement. Border inspections for commercial vehicles were routine, but cursory. As long as the paperwork was correct and nothing seemed suspicious, they'd wave them through. Diego would cross with 2 others. Carlos, a mechanic from Oaxaca, trying to reach his brother in Dallas, and Raul, a young guy from Guatemala, who said little but paid in cash without questions. They'd meet at the warehouse at 4 a.m., be loaded with the morning's produce shipment, and by noon they'd be at a grocery store in San Antonio where El Güero's people would extract them. The night before crossing, Diego couldn't sleep. He wrote Sophia a letter she was too young to read, explaining why Daddy had to break rules to see her. He'd give it to her when she was older, when she could understand that sometimes love required risks that looked like crimes to others. He sealed it in plastic, tucked it inside his jacket next to her photo. At 3:45 a.m., he stood outside the Hernandez brothers' warehouse, a massive refrigerated building humming with activity. Trucks were being loaded for the morning runs, forklifts moving pallets, workers shouting over machinery noise. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal morning at a successful business. Carlos arrived next, nervous but determined, carrying only a small backpack. Raul showed up exactly at 4 a.m., punctual and silent. El Güero's assistant, a thin man everyone called Flaco, led them to a side entrance into the organized chaos of the warehouse. Their truck was already half-loaded. Boxes of lettuce, tomatoes, avocados, the literal fruits of Mexican labor heading north to American tables. Flaco showed them the hiding spot, a false wall created by strategic stacking, leaving a cavity in the middle of the cargo. Air holes had been drilled through certain boxes. They have enough oxygen for the 6-hour journey. The space was tighter than Diego had imagined. 3 grown men pressed together, surrounded by produce boxes that shifted with every movement. They had to sit with knees drawn up, backs against the cold metal wall. Flacco handed them water bottles and plastic bags for emergencies, then began sealing them in with more boxes. As the last box slid into place, blocking out the warehouse lights, Diego felt a familiar panic. The trunk memories flooding back. The suffocating heat, the diminishing air, the moment he'd realized they'd been forgotten or abandoned. But this was different, he told himself. Professional, organized, safe. The truck doors slammed shut. The engine started, vibrating through their hiding spot. Diego could hear the driver, a man they'd been told was named Roberto, but who they'd never seen, talking casually with warehouse workers. Normal morning banter. Nothing suspicious. They pulled out of the warehouse into the pre-dawn darkness of Nuevo Laredo. Through the thin metal wall, Diego could hear traffic, smell diesel fumes, feel the stop and start of city driving. Carlos was already sweating despite the refrigerated cargo area. Raul remained perfectly still, eyes closed, like a man meditating or praying. The approach to the border was marked by longer stops, more traffic. Diego tried to track their progress mentally. The bridge would be packed with morning commuters, commercial traffic, the daily flow between sister cities. Their truck was just one of hundreds making legitimate deliveries. Nothing special. Nothing worth extra scrutiny. But something was wrong with the driver. Diego could hear him through the wall, talking on his phone in rapid, agitated Spanish. Not the casual conversation of a bored driver, but urgent, worried words. Something about signals and locations and timing. Carlos heard it too, his eyes widening in the darkness. Only Raul remained calm, unmoved by whatever drama was playing out in the cab. They reached the inspection point. Diego held his breath as the truck stopped. Official voices, papers rustling, the normal sounds of border bureaucracy. The driver's voice was different now, forced casual, slightly too loud. A bad actor reading lines he'd memorized but didn't believe. Minutes passed. The inspection seemed to be taking too long. Diego could hear footsteps around the truck. More voices joining the conversation. A dog barking, drug dogs, probably, though they had nothing to find. The produce smell should mask their human scent. Should. Then movement again. They were through. The truck accelerated onto bridge, crossing the Rio Grande, entering the United States. Diego allowed himself a moment of relief. The hardest part was over. Now just hours of uncomfortable hiding until San Antonio. But the phone calls continued. The driver's voice grew more agitated with each mile. He kept mentioning someone named Luis coordinates, changes in plans, something about police and signals and being tracked. Diego and Carlos exchanged worried glances. Raul finally opened his eyes, listening intently. They were maybe an hour past the border when the truck suddenly slowed. Not the gradual deceleration of traffic, but sharp braking, turning off the highway. Diego could hear gravel under the tires. They were leaving the main road, going somewhere unplanned. More phone conversation. The driver was nearly shouting now, panic clear in his voice. He mentioned El Güero, payment, promises broken, then a word that made Diego's blood freeze. Set up. They'd been set up. But by whom? And why? The truck stopped. Engine off. Silence except for their breathing and the tick of cooling metal. They waited, pressed together in their produce cave, none of them speaking the fear they all felt. This wasn't the grocery store in San Antonio. This wasn't part of the plan. Footsteps outside. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Not the casual approach of warehouse workers, but the coordinated movement of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Diego heard radio chatter. Police radios, the unmistakable official tone that meant their journey was over. The rear door opened slowly, professionally. Light flooded in, blinding after hours of darkness. Diego saw the silhouette of an officer, weapon drawn but not aimed, looking directly at their hiding spot despite the camouflage of produce boxes. He knew exactly where they were. The officer's face came into focus as Diego's eyes adjusted. Young, Hispanic, wearing the expression of someone who'd done this before and found no joy in it. He spoke in Spanish, telling them to come out slowly, keep their hands visible, no sudden movements. His tone was almost gentle, like a man coaxing frightened animals. They emerged from their hiding spot like newborns, cramped and blinking. Diego's legs barely worked after hours of compression. Carlos was crying silently. Raul looked resigned, unsurprised, as if he'd expected this ending all along. More officers surrounded the truck. But there was no aggression, no celebration of a successful bust. They moved with the efficiency of people completing paperwork, rather than catching dangerous criminals. One officer helped Carlos down from the truck when his legs gave out. Another offered water bottles. The driver sat in the back of a police car, head in his hands. Roberto, if that was his real name, looked broken, not defiant or angry, but defeated. Diego understood then that they'd all been pawns in someone else's game. The driver, the crossers, maybe even police, all playing roles in a script written by invisible hands. As they cuffed him, Diego asked the young officer how they'd known. The man looked uncomfortable, but answered honestly. The driver's phone had been tracked from the moment they left the warehouse. Every commercial vehicle crossing was monitored now. The moment Roberto had deviated from his registered route, alerts had gone out. They'd been watching via GPS, waiting for the truck to stop. But that raised more questions. Why had Roberto deviated? Why the panic phone calls? Who was Luis? And what setup was the driver screaming about? The truth emerged during processing. El Güero had been arrested 3 days earlier in a massive sweep. Facing decades in prison, he'd made a deal. Names, routes, methods, everything. The authorities had kept his arrest quiet, letting his operation continue just long enough to map the entire network. Roberto had been calling Luis, El Güero's lieutenant. Not knowing Luis was already in custody, his phone answered by federal agents. Every crossing attempt in the past 3 days had been monitored, allowed to proceed just far enough to gather evidence. Diego and his companions were just data points in a larger investigation. Their $8,000 each had bought them roles as unwitting informants in their own capture. The irony was sharp enough to cut. They'd paid to be betrayed, borrowed money, made promises, risked everything to walk into a trap that had been set before they'd even met El Güero. The professional operation they'd trusted was professional, all right, professionally dismantled by people who did this for a living. Processing was different this time. As a repeat offender, Diego faced serious federal charges. Not just illegal entry, but conspiracy. Human trafficking charges as a participant even though he'd been cargo, not crew. The system didn't distinguish between smugglers and smuggled when it needed statistics. Carlos broke down completely during questioning, begging for mercy, explaining about his brother in Dallas, the job waiting, the family depending on him. It didn't matter. Sympathy wasn't part of the legal equation. Raul remained silent through everything, refusing even confirm his name. Later, Diego learned he'd been deported twice before under different identities. The detention center was familiar, depressingly so. The same concrete walls, same desperate faces, same conversations about lawyers and bonds and possibilities that everyone knew were really impossibilities. Diego's cellmate was a Honduran who'd been caught in the same sweep, grabbed at a different crossing point by officers who'd been waiting just like the ones who caught Diego. The news covered it briefly. Major human smuggling ring dismantled. Officials posed with seized vehicles. Stacks of confiscated cash. El Güero wasn't shown. Protected witness now. His betrayal buying him a reduced sentence. The coverage mentioned dozens arrested, hundreds of migrants detained, millions in assets frozen. Victory declared in the endless border war. For Diego, the victory meant 2 years in federal prison before deportation. Not just for the crossing, but for the conspiracy charges. For being part of a criminal organization, even though his only crime was trusting criminals. His lawyer, overworked and underpaid, did what he could, but post 9/11 immigration law was unforgiving, especially for repeat offenders. He wrote Sophia letters from prison, knowing they'd likely never reach her. His ex-wife had blocked all contact after his arrest, not wanting their daughter associated with federal inmate. The letters piled up in his cell, A one-sided conversation with a child who was forgetting his face. His fellow inmates were a mix of border crossers and drug runners, violence and desperation sharing the same cells. Diego learned that his story was common. The betrayed driver, the monitor crossing, the setup disguised as opportunity. The government's new strategy: let the smuggling networks operate just long enough to map them completely, then roll them up in massive operations that look good in press releases. Roberto, the driver, got 5 years. Cooperating witness, but still guilty of conspiracy. Diego saw him once in the yard. Avoided eye contact. What was there to say? They'd both been desperate enough to trust El Güero, stupid enough to believe in foolproof plans. The driver had probably needed the money as badly as Diego needed to see his daughter. 2 years passed slowly. Diego worked in the prison kitchen, earned his GED, stayed out of trouble. He video called his mother in Mexico when allowed, watching her age in pixelated increments. She never asked why he'd tried again after the first disaster. She knew. A parent separated from their child understands desperation in ways that require no explanation. The day of his release and deportation came without fanfare. Processed out, driven to the border, walked across the bridge to Mexico with a packet of documents declaring him permanently inadmissible to the United States. Any future attempt would mean 10 years mandatory, no plea bargains, no mercy. Nuevo Laredo looked the same, but felt different. He was marked now, known to both smugglers and authorities. No coyote would touch him. Too much heat, too much risk. His construction job was gone, filled long ago. His brother couldn't look him in the eye. The borrowed $4,000, now a debt that would never be repaid. He found work eventually, warehouse labor that paid pennies but asked no questions. Rented a room in a boarding house full of other deportees, men whose American dreams had become Mexican nightmares. They drank cheap beer on Friday nights and told stories of crossings gone wrong, each trying to top the other's tale of betrayal and bad luck. But Diego's story usually won. The GPS tracking, the setup, the arrest before they'd even reached their destination. It had a special kind of cruelty. To be caught attempting was one thing. To be caught in a trap set before you'd even started was another. It spoke to a level of systemic defeat that made future attempts seem not just dangerous, but pointless. Sofia turned 7 while he was establishing his new life. He knew because his ex-wife had forgotten to block him on one social media platform, and he could see photos she was tagged in. His daughter playing soccer, blowing out birthday candles, calling another man daddy. Each image was a knife, but he couldn't stop looking. Sometimes he calculated the math of that failed crossing. $8,000 could have paid for immigration lawyers, maybe found some legal avenue he'd overlooked. Could have started a business in Mexico, built something Sofia might one day want to visit. Instead, it had bought him a federal conviction and a lifetime ban from the country, where his daughter was learning to forget him. The other men from the truck haunted his thoughts. Carlos, who just wanted to reach his brother. Raul, the silent one who'd seemed to expect betrayal. Where were they now? Had Carlos tried again? Had Raul found another identity, another route? Or were they, like Diego, grinding out days in Mexico, carrying the weight of that moment when the truck door opened and they realized they'd been sold out before they'd begun? He thought, too, about the young officer who'd arrested them, the apologetic look, the gentleness with documented cruelty. Did he think about the men he'd arrested? Did he know their stories, their reasons, their destinations? Or were they just names on reports, numbers and statistics, victories in a war that produced only casualties? 5 years after the arrest, Diego still worked at the warehouse, still lived in the boarding house, still checked social media for glimpses of Sofia, who was 10 now and beautiful and completely unaware that her father existed. The letter he'd written her that night remained in his possession, plastic-wrapped and fading, waiting for a delivery that would never come. Sometimes new arrivals asked him about crossing. Young men with that familiar desperation in their eyes, convinced their plan was different, their coyote trustworthy, their luck better. He told them about the delivery truck, the GPS tracking, the trap that had been set before they'd started. Some listened. Most didn't. Hope was stronger than warning, always had been. He'd learned the hardest truth about the modern border. Technology had made it a different game. Not just walls and agents, but satellites and databases and tracking systems that turned every crossing into a data point in someone's computer. The romance of sneaking across had been replaced by the reality of algorithmic surveillance. Even successful crossings were just delayed captures. Every undocumented person a future statistic waiting to happen. Diego Luna had paid $8,000 to hide in a delivery truck. The police had been waiting before he'd even climbed aboard. He'd served 2 years for the crime of trusting criminals, of believing that desperation could overcome technology, of thinking that a father's love was stronger than international law. He carried all of it now. The memory of produced boxes and cramped darkness, the driver's panic phone calls, the officer's apologetic face, the federal prison cell, the bridge back to Mexico, the photos of a daughter who called another man daddy, $8,000 converted to loss, measured in years and tears, and the growing silence where a child's laughter should have been. Some borders are made of walls and wire. Others are made of betrayal and tracking devices, and the distance between a father and a daughter who doesn't know his name. Diego had crossed the first kind twice, failed twice, paid the price twice. The second kind proved uncrossable, no matter how much money you paid or how many delivery trucks you hid in. He still worked, still saved money, though for what he couldn't say. Still carried Sophia's photo next to the letter she'd never read. Still woke, sometimes thinking he heard her voice, only to remember that she spoke English now, a language he was learning too late for it to matter. The delivery trucks still crossed daily, legitimate now, carrying only produce. Diego watched them from the warehouse, wondering if anyone still tried, if El Güero's replacement had found new methods, new trucks, new desperate people willing to pay for betrayal disguised as opportunity. Probably. Certainly. The game continued with new players, but the same rules, the same endings, the same bridges walked back to Mexico with dreams aborted and futures foreclosed. His story ended where it began. In Nuevo Laredo, watching America from the wrong side, knowing that somewhere in Houston a 10-year-old girl was growing up without him. The truck, the arrest, the prison, those were just chapters. The real story was simpler and sadder. A father who'd risked everything to see his daughter and lost even the little he'd had. $8,000. 2 federal convictions. 1 permanent separation. That was the math of the modern border. Calculated in hearts broken and hopes betrayed, measured by the distance between a warehouse in Mexico and a child in Texas who would never know how much her father had paid to fail to reach her.